Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really pivotal and, much debated period, the run-up to and aftermath of the 2014 Maidan protests in Ukraine.
That's right.
We've got a collection of sources here that offer, a particular vantage point on these events.
Mhm.
They largely center on Russia's perspectives, its security concerns, and how it interpreted the actions of the European Union and the United States.
Yeah, and that's key here. Our goal in this deep dive is really to thoroughly explore the key arguments and details within these specific sources to understand this particular interpretation of the Ukraine crisis.
Okay, so let's get into it.
Absolutely. And right from the start, it's, vital to keep in mind that we're examining a specific reading of these events.
Right.
The material we're working with really emphasizes Russia's apprehensions and the narrative it constructed around things like the EU's association agreement, the involvement of Western powers, and the Maidan protests themselves.
So let's start right there with that EU association agreement. These sources really point out it wasn't just a trade deal.
No, not at all.
It had significant teeth, apparently, in terms of military and security policy.
Yeah, things like potential Ukrainian participation in the EU's Common Security and Defense Policy, the GSVP.
Exactly. For missions like peacekeeping, but also political dialogue on security, counterterrorism,
Aligning their positions in places like the UN and OSCE.
and even moving towards EU defense standards, potentially getting involved in EU arms cooperation.
Plus cooperation on border control, intelligence sharing, specifically targeting hybrid threats, as they put it.
Now, here's where it becomes a major point of contention, right? From Russia's perspective, according to these sources, this raised some serious alarms.
Indeed. This perspective holds that Russia viewed these security aspects as a direct infringement on Ukraine's, its neutral status.
Okay.
It was seen as a kind of gradual move towards NATO membership, a creeping path to NATO. That's the phrase used in the sources.
Or a soft militarization through the EU.
Right. And given that, a significant number of EU members are also NATO members, this was naturally perceived as a potential security risk right on Russia's border.
And this viewpoint emphasizes that Russia saw the EU's security policy, the GSVP, as basically being, NATO compatible.
NATO compatible, and with the U.S. having considerable influence behind the scenes.
But it wasn't solely about NATO, was it?
No, the sources argue Russia also saw it as a clear geopolitical maneuver.
Aimed at undermining its own interests, like the Eurasian Economic Union and its own security setups like the CIS or CSTO.
Exactly. That's the interpretation presented here. A calculated effort to pull Ukraine away from Russia's sphere of influence.
And this perspective suggests Russia connected this push with U.S. support for NGOs in Ukraine and the Maidan protests.
Yes, leading to deep suspicions about a larger agenda, perhaps a regime change agenda in Kyiv.
So from this standpoint, even without Ukraine formally joining NATO, the security parts of the EU deal were seen as a kind of military strategic precedent.
A very significant one, according to this narrative.
Okay, turning to the broader role of the West, the EU and the U.S. These sources present a pretty critical assessment.
They do. The argument put forward is that the EU acted as geopolitical bait, really pushing this association agreement hard in 2013.
And supposedly without properly considering Ukraine's deep economic links with Russia at the time.
That's a crucial element of this narrative, yeah. It suggests the economic benefits for Ukraine were maybe limited compared to the big structural changes needed.
Especially regarding its ties within the Eurasian Economic Union.
Right. The sources also mention Russia proposing trilateral talks, Brussels, Moscow, Kyiv, and the claim is the EU basically said no.
Delivering an ultimatum, choose Europe or Russia.
That's the message conveyed in this perspective.
So when Yanukovych ultimately said no in November 2013, citing those economic reasons,
The protests erupted almost immediately. That's how the sources frame it.
and this is where the narrative of heavy Western involvement really kicks in. The claim is massive backing from Western NGOs, media, politicians.
And, crucially, significant financial support from the United States, allegedly.
This view even mentions EU figures like Catherine Ashton being on the Maidan.
But the argument goes that the EU quickly lost control of the situation.
Which leads to this central claim in the sources. The EU might have started the diplomatic pressure, but the U.S. then took over operationally.
That's the thesis presented.
Right, and they point to leaked communications, don't they? Like the "Yats is the guy" call between Nuland and Pyatt.
Yes, as evidence of the U.S. actively shaping the interim government before Yanukovych was even out.
And then, of course, the infamous "fuck the EU" remark.
presented as clear proof the U.S. was sidelining and, frankly, disregarding its European partners.
The narrative painted here is, well, quite strong. It suggests the U.S. pushed through what these sources call a coup government.
With the support of nationalist factions, yeah. So the Maidan isn't depicted as a purely grassroots popular uprising.
But more as a U.S.-directed power project.
That's the interpretation.
And according to this viewpoint, the consequences played out very differently for the EU and the U.S.
Right. The EU allegedly got sanctions, energy crises, migration pressure, economic losses.
While the U.S. supposedly benefited. Stronger ties via NATO, Nord Stream halted, booming arms industry.
That's the contrast drawn. The conclusion from this perspective is basically the EU triggered Maidan, but Washington hijacked it.
With Ukraine as the primary loser, fractured, devastated, instrumentalized.
And the EU as the second loser, weakened, economically damaged, and strategically more dependent on the U.S.
Okay, let's pivot to the Maidan sniper controversy. This is obviously a deeply sensitive and highly debated part of these events.
Very much so. And these sources acknowledge that ongoing disagreement and the political heat around the shootings in February 2014.
The official Ukrainian and Western view, as laid out here, blames Yanukovych's security forces, the Berkut units.
The claim being excessive force against largely peaceful protesters.
And it's noted that many Berkut officers were charged, though some consider the evidence incomplete.
But then these sources bring in critical and alternative perspectives, including, naturally, the Russian interpretation.
Yes, Professor Ivan Kachanovsky's analysis is highlighted.
Right. His research using videos, audio, ballistics, witness accounts suggests many shots actually came from buildings controlled by the Maidan opposition.
Like the Hotel Ukraina specifically mentioned.
And his analysis apparently indicates victims included both protesters and police, often shot from the same directions.
Leading to the conclusion, in his view, that it might have been a deliberate provocation to force an escalation.
That's the suggestion presented from his analysis.
These sources also mention witness accounts and leaked audio that seem to challenge the official story.
Yeah, doubts reportedly expressed by Berkut members, civilians, even some opposition politicians.
And that leaked Ashton Pate call comes up again, suggesting even some Western diplomats had information hinting at opposition involvement in provocations.
The Russian portrayal, as presented here, is very direct. They call it an armed coup,
where armed provocateurs, allegedly with Western backing, forced the violence to overthrow Yanukovych,
install a pro-Western government, and pull Ukraine out of Russia's orbit. That's the essence of their narrative described here.
Okay, let's talk about Nuland's "fuck the EU" remark specifically. Our sources give the context. Leaked phone call, early February 2014.
Between Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt, yeah. And they're discussing who should be in a new Ukrainian interim government.
Before Yanukovych was actually ousted.
Exactly. The source is, quote, Nuland preferring Yatsenyuk, Yats is the guy, and dismissing Klitschko.
And then the "fuck the EU" line itself.
It's explained the call was likely intercepted and leaked, probably by Russian or pro-Russian intelligence, first appearing on YouTube.
And significantly, the authenticity wasn't really denied. The U.S. State Department confirmed the call happened, but called the leak new Russian low-point propaganda.
Nuland did apologize to the EU, specifically to Ashton.
But the significance, the political fallout, according to these sources, was huge.
Well, it seemed to reveal active, detailed U.S. meddling in Ukraine's internal affairs, down to picking personnel.
Critics saw it as proof of Western control over the Maidan process before the official power change.
Definitely. And it was seen as a major breach with European partners, right when the EU was trying to play a diplomatic role.
Caused a lot of resentment in the EU, even if it wasn't a full-blown crisis.
Crucially, for the narrative we're looking at, that remark became key evidence in Russian media and alternative circles.
Used to argue the Maidan wasn't a genuine Ukrainian movement, but an externally orchestrated power grab.
Right. The sources conclude it became symbolic of a perceived, arrogant, power-driven U.S. approach, giving Russia rhetorical ammunition.
Let's move to another really difficult event. The tragedy in Odessa, May 2nd, 2014, the trade union house fire.
Yeah, these sources describe it as one of the bloodiest and most symbolically charged incidents of the conflict.
The official death toll cited is 48, mostly supporters of pro-Russian or federalist positions.
And the Russian view, according to these sources, is stark. A massacre, or politically motivated pogrom, that they claim remains uninvestigated by Ukraine.
The sources outline the background. Escalating tensions in Odessa post-Maidan between pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian federalist groups.
Clashes erupted in the city center on May 2nd, with at least 6 deaths reported from gunfire before the fire,
Then the events at the trade union house itself. Pro-Russian activists reportedly retreated into the building.
which was then surrounded by pro-Ukrainian activists and allegedly attacked with Molotov cocktails.
Though these sources do note claims that some inside the building also threw incendiary devices, so not necessarily one-sided use of those weapons.
But the result was a massive, devastating fire inside.
Many died from smoke, burns, or jumping from windows.
The official toll of 48, mostly pro-Russian, is repeated, but the sources also mention unofficial estimates suggesting the number might be higher.
Okay, now let's dig into what our sources call Russia's proxy war narrative on Ukraine. This section basically lays out the argument from Russia's viewpoint that Ukraine was deliberately built up as a Western proxy against Russia after 2014.
Right. It starts with the political shift. The argument is the post-Maidan leadership took a radically pro-Western path.
Actions like abandoning neutrality, the 2019 constitutional goal for NATO.
Banning pro-Russian parties and media, promoting historical narratives Russia sees as biased, decommunization, de-Russification.
From Russia's perspective presented here, Ukraine was being ideologically and politically turned into a frontline state against them.
Then there's the military buildup. These sources detail systematic arming and training of Ukrainian forces by the US, UK, Canada, other NATO states post-2014.
Mentioning things like Western-trained battalions, Javelin missiles from the US.
British training in urban warfare. Modern drones like the Turkish Bayraktar TB2s, advanced radar and surveillance.
The Russian perspective here is that this wasn't just defensive. It was seen as deliberate preparation for a major conflict with Russia.
And it goes beyond just gear and training. The narrative contends Ukraine was increasingly integrated into NATO structures, even without being a member.
Examples like joint exercises Sea Breeze, Rapid Trident.
Yes, using Ukrainian territory for NATO logistics and training, close intelligence cooperation, real-time recon data from NATO satellites.
So Russia, according to this view, saw Ukraine becoming a de facto NATO outpost right on its border, ignoring its security interests.
Then there's the Minsk agreements issue, meant to resolve the Donbass conflict.
The Russian claim, as presented, is Kyiv never really implemented the political parts, like autonomy laws.
Instead, allegedly isolating the rebel areas militarily and economically, frequently violating ceasefires.
And Merkel's later comment about Minsk buying time for Ukraine's military buildup is highlighted here, too.
The Russian interpretation presented is stark. The West deliberately lied, misled Russia, just to strengthen Kyiv for a showdown.
Finally, the red lines issue. Russia's repeated warnings about NATO membership.
Despite those warnings, NATO kept its open-door policy. Ukraine legally and structurally moved closer to NATO, making membership a strategic goal.
Russia's December 2021 demand for written security guarantees was rejected.
So the Russian view presented is one of deliberate provocation, being pushed into a corner, facing an unacceptable threat of NATO infrastructure on its border.
The overall conclusion from this perspective, Ukraine was systematically built into an anti-Russian stronghold after 2014, directed, financed, armed by the West, especially the U.S.
With Maidan as the starting point of this transformation, making Kyiv a proxy in a hybrid war, Russia, therefore, frames its 2022 invasion not as aggression, but as a preventative forced response.
Okay, let's look now at Russia's view post-Maidan conflict. This details Russia's interpretation of events immediately following what they called the February 2014 coup and how these escalated things.
First, they emphasized the formation of the interim government in Kyiv after Yanukovych fled, despite him having signed a compromise deal mediated by the EU.
Russia viewed this as an unconstitutional coup, not a democratic transition.
Seeing the new government as composed of pro-Western and nationalist forces hostile to Russia.
And one of the first actions highlighted is the move to abolish the law on regional languages.
Right. Even though it wasn't fully implemented, Moscow reportedly saw it as discrimination against Russian speakers and a sign of forced nationalist Ukrainization.
This then leads into the Crimea crisis, Russia's reaction to the power change, concerns about NATO in the Black Sea,
resulting in Russian control over Crimea late Feb 2014 and the March referendum, with a reported massive vote to join Russia.
The Russian perspective presented frames this as self-determination by Crimeans facing a hostile Kyiv.
Which, of course, contrasts sharply with the Western view of illegal annexation.
Then the uprising in Donbass, pro-Russian demos escalating into armed conflict, the Donbass War.
Declaration of the Unrecognized People's Republics, Kyiv launching its anti-terrorist operation with attacks on eastern cities.
Russia's view, per these sources, Kyiv waging a civil war against its own people, refusing political solutions, using military force.
While Western reports indicated Russian military support, Russia officially denied direct involvement early on, citing volunteers and aid.
And all this led to the deepening confrontation between Russia and the West since 2014.
Sanctions, increased NATO presence in Eastern Europe, joint training, Ukraine's declared pro-Western path, including the NATO goal.
From Russia's perspective, this just confirmed Maidan was part of a geopolitical proxy conflict, integrating Ukraine into a Western project against Russian interests. Let's pull back slightly for the broader geopolitical context. Ukraine crisis, a geopolitical power struggle.
Yeah, this section frames the whole sequence within that wider strategic competition.
The EU Association Agreement, again, presented as partnership, but viewed by Russia as leverage to separate Ukraine from the post-Soviet space.
Yanukovych's rejection under Russian pressure is seen as the trigger, highlighting stakes beyond just trade.
And it emphasizes the U.S. foreign policy focus on Ukraine alongside the EU efforts. Long-standing U.S. programs via NGOs like USA, NAD.
To shape civil society, yeah. And the sources stress massive Western support, public, financial, strategic, for the Maidan protests.
Nuland's calls referenced again, suggesting the U.S. aimed to dictate who ruled Kyiv, making the EU secondary.
Then the core question, Maidan as uprising or orchestrated overthrow? Western view versus the Russian view of a controlled regime change, a color revolution.
The unresolved sniper issue is mentioned again as key in escalating and justifying the ouster.
And the installation of a pro-Western interim government without elections, seen by Russia as unconstitutional.
NATO expansion comes back as a critical factor, often downplayed in Western media, according to this view.
Russia seeing it as a breach of promises, Ukraine's potential membership unacceptable. The 2008 Bucharest summit hint is mentioned.
The Russian view presented not defense, but encirclement, with the West refusing to address legitimate Russian security concerns.
Finally, the idea of the coup as a turning point. Post-Maidan restructuring influenced by Western advisors.
Leading to an argument that the new government served Western interests, maybe not Ukrainian ones. IMF loans, austerity, language policies.
With the Donbass conflict as a direct consequence, the Russian view presented, Ukraine didn't gain sovereignty, just swapped dependence on Moscow for dependence on Washington and Brussels.
The conclusion here is that the escalation was part of a geopolitical power struggle, EU as facilitator, US as main architect, Russia reacting to encroachment. Understanding it, these sources argue, requires acknowledging Western interventions and interests.
Okay, final section titled, Ukraine, from EU pact to US regime change. This really pushes the idea of the US snatching Ukraine from Europe.
It recaps the EU Association Agreement offer in No. 2013 market access, but excluding cooperation with Russia.
Mentions Russia's trilateral talk offer again, and Brussels' insistence on a choice, framing it as politically short-sighted and geopolitically risky.
Yanukovych's rejection due to economic concerns, then the Euromaidan protests.
And the argument returns. What started as popular discontent quickly became an externally controlled power project.
While EU reps were present, Washington took control, the Nuland calls cited again as key evidence.
Arguing a government aligned ideologically and structurally with the West was installed, bypassing democratic processes, making Maidan less revolution, more externally driven regime change.
Then the alleged costs for Europe, energy cooperation damage, sanctions impact, refugees versus U.S. gains like geopolitical influence, economic benefits.
The sources conclude here by stating the Maidan events show how Europe was geopolitically instrumentalized. It started something it couldn't control.
While the U.S. seized the opportunity to implement its own agenda.
Posing that final question.
Yeah.
How long will Europe act as a tool before protecting its own strategic interests?
So to kind of wrap up the main threads from the sources we've looked at, well, a very consistent narrative emerges, doesn't it?
It really does. The EU's association agreement, the subsequent actions by the U.S., all perceived by Russia in this telling as aggressive encroachments on its sphere of influence and direct threats to its security.
Precisely. These sources present a specific and, consistent viewpoint, one that strongly emphasizes Russia's interpretation of Maidan as a Western-orchestrated regime change.
With the goal of installing an anti-Russian proxy state in Ukraine.
Now, it's absolutely crucial for you, the listener, to remember these are incredibly complex events. There are many, many differing interpretations out there.
Definitely. The sources we've explored in this deep dive offer one particular but significant lens through which to understand the lead-up to the ongoing and tragic conflict in Ukraine.
And on that note, we leave you with this final thought. Considering these different perspectives, what really are the enduring consequences of these events? Not just for the region, but for the broader geopolitical landscape, and maybe even for the very idea of national sovereignty.
It's a lot to think about.
It is. We strongly encourage you to continue your own independent research and to critically analyze the diverse narratives surrounding the Ukraine crisis. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.